Hi everyone, and welcome to a video that I know is likely to be quite contentious and has many people having many different opinions. But I want to talk through a little bit around why I've chosen to build a time-based system and why, in my opinion, time matters. I'm going to talk through a number of different options today, and this video might be a little bit longer than some of the others. But basically going to talk through the options that are available, what sports do this really well and how it works, and then focus a little bit upon why I think we can make a time-based system work and why it's important that it's focused in that manner. So what are the possible options? Well, if we look at other sports for inspiration here, there tends to be four. And we have an out-and-out points-based system. We have position event rating mix. So, for example, first in a big event scores more than first in a smaller scale event. We have money rankings. And then we have obviously what is based today in triathlon, which is time-based ratings or score-based ratings, for example, in other sports like, say, golf. I've made some assumptions, and obviously I'm not a professional athlete, so these are assumptions from what I believe people would refer to. So endurance athletes won't race more than 8 events a year. Lionel and Joe Skipper might disagree with me, but most athletes won't race more than that. Ironman full-based athletes shouldn't be penalised for racing less. So obviously 70.3 based athletes, in theory, could race multiple weekends, could race, say, 8 to 10 times a year, but someone like Sebastian Kienle might only race 3 or 4 times a year. And also, I'm making the assumption that as of today, similar scale events, such as low ranking events and potentially even high rated events, have very different monies across Challenge, PTO, and Ironman. For example, Challenge Roth's prize money is significantly less than the PTO Championships, which may be a similar scale event, or something like a regional championships with Ironman. Okay, position points. Who does this really well? Well, the obvious answer is Formula One, and they have points per race that take place. Now, a couple of notes for why this works for them. It's always the same field, give or take. A couple of times they change drivers throughout the year. They are always scored against an event that takes place on the same track, and it's head-to-head. There's a predetermined number of events at the start of the year. They know going in there's going to be 24 events or 20 events. No single race is more important than the other. So you can score the same amount of points at any race that you go to. And the World Championships is determined off of who wins the points rating over the course of the year. Again, works really well for them. Now, in triathlon, I just want to run through how this would work. So here's my 2021 season. So I was fortunate enough to be the first overall age grouper. I would get 10 points. I was then first in my age group. So again, another 10 points. And again, my third best race this year was first overall age grouper. Now, some of you know me, so this slide won't surprise you. Now, here's the truth. The first overall age grouper was in a go try. I've turned up with a disc wheel and a tri spoke, and I went past a few people with who had baskets on their bike, but I had the fastest time. I was first in my age group, but I was the only one in my age group. And no offense to Lionel and to Jan, but I invited my mate along who isn't as good as me, and there's only 2 of us in the race, and I came first. It's a different story to what you saw before, but I would still score the maximum points for the season. Points event based. So who does this well? Well, tennis do this. So depending upon the event that you're on and the round that you get to determines upon what points you get. Now, the first thing to note, there is a tournament pretty much every single weekend, and often there is multiple tournaments every weekend. We're talking 10 different tournaments down at the bottom level for the ATP rankings. They're given points after the round that they get to. So, for example, anyone knocked out in the semi-finals, obviously they would get the same points for the 2 that are knocked out there, which would be 720 each. So it's a tie for anyone in those ranks. And the most important thing here is that the draw is actually based on the rankings. So number 1 in the first round normally plays the highest rank, would normally play the weakest rank in the first round. So it's very easy for the top ranked people to get through, but very hard for those who are actually at the bottom to get past the round of 128, for example, because they're normally going to be competing against the best in the world. It becomes very difficult for them to get up those rankings without doing so. Also, this is based on the best 16 results from the year. So obviously 4 of those are going to be Grand Slams, and then other tournaments through that period. So what's the issue here for triathlon? Well, the first thing is you can't compare this to the same track or course. And that's the same with the points rated system that we looked at before. They don't always go head to head. Sometimes there will be weak fields in large events. So, for example, nobody could turn up to a regional championships and somebody who's ranked 150 in the world happens to win, and suddenly they get points that catapults them into the top 5 in the world. Is that a fair system? Maybe not. Athletes will race small and large events. So throughout the course of the season, somebody may choose to go and validate for a Kona spot at a relatively small scale a relatively small scale Ironman. But this would actually be detrimental to their points, but doesn't always work for their calendar, because if they know that they're going to race Kona in October, they won't probably race after July in an Ironman event. Again, Joe and Lionel exceptions. In this scenario, somebody who races more than others could in theory score more. You would take an average in the end or set how many points it comes from, but when you get down to it, there's not really enough events for this to work. And similarly with the issues with the tennis score, athletes who don't qualify for world championships would struggle to move up, because that's where you get the larger events. So those who get invites to Kona, for example, could catapult themselves where they haven't necessarily earned it. And that's often an issue with wildcard events, wildcard entries for majors in tennis. I just wanted to run through 2 different things here. Now, this is on the assumption that you don't have a limit, or maybe the limit's 5. The athlete 1 here races 3 times in the year. So they come second in the Euro Championships and has an incredibly strong field, but they come second, so they get 95 points. They come 5th at Worlds, again, that's 95 points, slightly higher rating, and they win Ironman UK, again, 50, so that's 55 points. That gives them a total of 245. Athlete 2 comes 4th in African Championships in a really weak field. They get 85 points. 4th in a challenge event, 5th at 70.3 Warsaw, 2nd at Ironman UK, and 6th at PTO Eton. There is a mistake there. That should be 45 points. And that gives a total of the same points overall. Who's had the better season? You can't really tell in the points basis, but I always say athlete 1. And here's a couple of thoughts for you. If you think any of these are wrong, this system won't work. So should an athlete who has a time of 9 hours score the same amount of points as someone who scores 8 hours 30 on the similar course? So who goes 8 hours 30 on a similar course? Now, with a same status event, even on the same course, this feasibly could happen. If somebody wins Ironman UK with 9 hours, and then in the same year it's done again with 8 hours 30 on the same course, they would get the same points. Should strong performances in small events still have an effect on the rankings? Well, we've just seen Gustav and Christian's performance in their Ironman debuts, which are incredibly fast, but in events that are ranked pretty low, they would get very small points for this in that system. And then the biggest thing is that if you miss out on a world championships or choose not to race it, you're very highly penalized here. So, for example, Jan and Lionel, who chose not to race 70.3 worlds, would find themselves tumbling down the leaderboard. This would also happen if you were injured for any part of the season where one of those majors effectively falls. And as we get more majors that appear to be coming in, missing a single one of those could be detrimental. And that could even be for calendar clashes and things like that. The next option is money rankings. So who does this well? Well, golf tend to rank themselves off of money, but it should be noted that this isn't used for the world rankings. They actually use a points and event-based system as above. This is only used to determine who has done the best on each tour. Now, that's specifically important, for example, because they even acknowledge that where the US tour is a lot more, the PGA tour in the United States is a lot more, has a lot more money in it. They end up with a far higher rating than anybody on the European tour who could have the same results across that period, but earn far less. So that's, for example, if you do really well in Ironman or the PTO-backed events where they've got slightly higher prize money, you would end up with a far higher rating than someone who does really well in challenge events. The biggest thing to note with the prize money, though, is that in golf, it pays down to 70. And I looked on the prize, the PGA Tour prize money lists, and the person who had earned the least amount of money was ranked 256th in their tour. So the big issues for triathlon here is there's huge variance of prize money for similar events. For example, Ironman might have a relatively low-key Ironman event and give $75,000 for that event, whereas a challenge event might only be giving out $15,000. But the status of that event is very similar other than the prize money. Also, some prize monies tend to be inflated in certain countries. So, for example, we tend to see higher prize ratings for Ironman in the US than in other areas. Gives an advantage to some athletes. There is a benefit to racing more events. The more you do, the more money you earn. Some events pay appearance fees rather than prize money. How would this be accounted for? And in some events, this is the biggest issue. Only the top 5 earn money. So it's not like down to 70 or make the cut in golf. And I've done a worked example here of somebody's season who has a relatively good season for a middle of the road athlete, and they earn no money. So it could be that people ranked even in the top 100 can't have a rating on this because they've earned $0 for the whole year. It seems a little bit harsh. Now, first of all, I'm going to talk about the issues of time-based. Now, there are issues, without a doubt. Obviously, some pros believe it can be subjective. Yes, it can if you don't do it right. It really can be subjective. And especially if you're not publishing the times beforehand or giving clear examples as to why it can be. Some don't like racing for time or pushing for points. I understand that, and I can understand that if you're winning, sometimes it's nice to sit up, relax, enjoy the atmosphere. Great. There can be ways around that, and I'll discuss that on the next slide. Some courses are obviously quicker than others, down current swims, for example. Without rating, it doesn't actually take into account the scale of the event. So a time at the PTO event at Eton Dorney could be deemed the same as a time at 70.3 Worlds. How do you understand that? And the biggest issue is that people don't understand the times and don't understand how it all works. But how can it work? What if we pre-publish and predefine the course rating, the event rating, and the ideal times? It gives you an understanding as to where you are. Obviously, there will be a number of times that go towards it. So that might be 3 events. And if you're winning in your 4th event or in an event that pre-publishes obviously a very quick time because it's a low status and you're there as a B race, you know you can sit up because you know it's probably not going to affect your ranking anyway, good or bad. So you can sit up and get to the finish line. This is a luxury that obviously only the people at the front of the race tend to have. I haven't seen many pros who sit up in 4th place and might get catched by 5th. You know, they're always trying to catch the person in front of them and do the best that they can. So a little less sympathy for this because realistically it only affects people who are out front racing themselves. And yeah. Before the event, the pros can agree the event status. So what's important to pros? And that could be that an event like Challenge Roth is really important to them, even though the prize money is relatively low. But the pros get to say that one's important to us, and that's what we want to race for, and it should be rated higher. But that won't be the case of, oh, I'm going to that event, it's now important to me. It'll be predefined at the start of the year. Make the system easy to understand, put ratings in place, and fully publish as to what it's going to look like. And then have an openness and explanation around the results. So I'm willing to sit and talk about the results, talk about the points that are there to help people understand what's happened. Ultimately, with all of the things that we've just spoken about, is do we want to be able to compare two performances that happened on two different courses? And obviously, springs to mind here Christian Blumenfeld versus Gustav Iden. Now, my last video touched upon this, but I'm going to go through this again. So in a points-based system, they both won. It would be a tie. In a points and event-based system, they both won an event, relatively low-key. Yet the prize money was in the realms where we could consider it similar. So again, a tie. Now in money, Gustav would win simply because the prize pot was £25,000 more. That was obviously shared, so he won a little bit more money than Christian did for his performance in Cozumel. In a time only, with no kind of status of event breaking that in, very, very close, and this does flip either way, then Christian would win on that time basis just because of what's there. Now, if we take into account the course and we take into account the fact that there was that little bit more prize money for Gustav, on a time and status base, Gustav would actually come out on top. But it gives us an opportunity to compare their two times. And when we look at it, we can see, for example, that Christian's run was slightly short. So it would relate to a slightly longer time. And if he was racing directly against Gustav, maybe he wouldn't have won. And that's what this would enable us to do through times. But let's forget about the top pros and what does it look like further down the system. Now, I've taken pros completely out of this. And at the time of these races, all of these people were amateurs or age groupers. So there's three events here. We've got Andrew Horsfall Turner, who came second at Outlaw Half Nottingham. He was the first age grouper. Harry Palmer, who came fourth at Outlaw Half Holcombe, and he was the first age grouper. And then Stephen Derrant, who was the overall winner of Ironman 70.3 Weymouth, which didn't have a pro field this year. Now, if we look at their times, okay, there's a bit of variance, but specifically Harry's and Andrew's time are very similar. Now, if we looked at it on points, all three of them would have exactly the same points. If we looked at it on money, all three would have the same money. And assuming that they had the same prize money for coming first, again, it would be the same. The only differential here is the course and the times that they've got. But they're all amateurs as well. So how can we work this? Well, in my system, we can actually extrapolate this out and make a system where we can rank amateurs as well as ranking professionals versus the time that they achieve. Now, these are examples, but what I've done here is I've created what would be called a standard professional time. So on the course, this would be, what would they have to do for a professional time to score 50 points? Now, this doesn't take into account the status, it just takes into account the course difficulty versus our dream team relay that we've ranked the courses off. So not a 100-point time, but a 50-point time on the assumption that this would be a standard professional time. Now, this can obviously move. Immediately, we can see here that Harry's time was a lot closer to that standard pro time of 50 points. And interestingly, obviously, there was 3 pros ahead of him. And both him and Andrew have since turned pro off the back of these performances. This can mean that further down, we can start to compare performances and see that Harry's performance was slightly better than Andrew's over 2 events that were there. What this also does is potentially it means that we can start to see when people are good enough at turning professional based off of a standardized format, not based off of a percentage of the overall winner. If for some reason Christian Blumenfeld or Gustav Iden decided to come race Outlaw Half Holcombe, the 4% differential that British Triathlon currently give, Harry wouldn't be a pro. But at the moment, he's only 2 minutes down on what a standard pro time would be. And maybe this is something we could build into this, like a handicap system where you're under 3 in golf, you can turn professional. But again, based off time. And for me, that's why time is really important. And I hope I've explained through some different options. But we will be open, it will explain everything. But for me, it's based off time. So we can compare results and we can determine who we think had the better race in areas such as anybody across the course of the season and against yourself. So if you turn up to an event and you've done one time here and one time there, which result was actually better? Pro or age grouper? Speak to you next time. Thank you.